Okay, well, I said we were going to talk about natural gas, but I actually forgot a whole chunk that I was going to do on oil. So just kidding, we're still doing oil. Um, so we need to talk about once you have all this oil, your tar sands, whatever, how do we work on transporting it and what happens and the controversies with that. So one of the major ways when other than shipping it on large barges is that you can ship oil through pipelines, which is what we use in the United States. We have these pipelines that go across vast areas of land, taking that crude oil that we're getting out of the ground and taking it back down to the refineries. A lot of those refineries are down in the south where they cook the oil and then distill it out into the different areas, different substances that it creates. So, um, pipelines have kind of their own set of problems. You get leaks, you get spills. Like I mentioned with the caribou, you get habitat loss, blocked migratory pathways, all kinds of things can go on. Now, lately, over the last couple years, what's really been a major controversial issue is an extension to an existing pipeline that they wanted to do because of all these Canadian tar sands that we're getting, bringing them down. They basically want to have an easier way getting the tar sands from Canada down to the south where the refineries are. And so the green dots on this map here represent this pipeline extension, which is called the Keystone Pipeline. So they wanted to extend certain parts of it. And what happened was these big oil companies put in their proposal that they were going to do this. And the local people in those areas where suddenly they were going to have this, you see that number 3 there, where they were going to have the Keystone Pipeline come through, started fighting back, and they said we don't want an oil pipeline in our area. We don't want the leaks, we don't want the spills, we don't want the disruption of habitat, we don't want it. So locals and environmentalists started fighting back pretty hard, and it's been an ongoing battle for a while. um, Recently President Obama, I think it was back in September or something, said that he wasn't necessarily opposed to the pipeline, but he wasn't going to support it if it was going to exacerbate the carbon dioxide or carbon pollution issue, which basically, if you're increasing the amount of oil that you're putting into a refinery, you're exacerbating the problem. So I'm not really sure exactly what that statement means, but actually, just today, I read an article from Forbes magazine or paper that I put a link to on Facebook that basically said that even though environmentalists were fighting back against this pipeline, thinking that, okay, we're going to stop, we're going to make them slow down this production of tar sands because it's, it does all these destructive things. Well, the large oil companies up in Canada said, fine, forget that, we won't use the pipelines. Now they've decided that they're going to increase their production of tar sands, and what they're actually deciding to do is instead of continuing to battle these locals and these environmentalists on where the pipeline's going to go, they've decided they're going to use railway transport. So they're going to be loading these tar sands into railway cars on trains and sending it across the country that way. Now, the major issue with that is that trains have a 16-time greater chance of having accidents and incidents than you do with pipelines. So we thought we were doing a good thing by fighting back, and now the problem is that you can't really fight back against railroad lines because it's already, an infrastructure that's in place, and you've got a much greater chance of incidents happening. So, it all comes from people talking out. We have to make some changes. We have to get our representatives to understand that, we want to make changes. We want to wean ourselves off oil and make better steps. So I just like to bring up this issue because our energy sources are a big controversial issue right now. And one of the big things that I personally would like to hear more about in the politics in this last presidential debate, we really didn't hear much about climate change or energy. It was all focused on, economics and healthcare. But if you want your voice to be heard, that's the only way you can do it is to vote. Now, here's some details on that Keystone Pipeline extension. It would basically send that oil from northeastern Canada down to the refineries in the Midwest and to the Gulf Coast. And then Obama said in September that he would only approve and support the extension if it doesn't further exacerbate the carbon pollution. Again, not really possible. And then there's that mention of the article that I put a link to on Facebook, and they're going to be using that railway transport. So the pictures down there, you've got You got the people who are fighting against climate change, against no tar sands, it being destructive, and then at the same time, it's always a balancing act. At the same time, you've got people who are suffering in an economy that's not doing really good and they want the jobs. So they do want the pipeline to go through because they need to eat, they need to support their families. So it's always a balancing act when it comes to environmental science and environmental politics. You've always got to find that middle ground, and that's where sound science comes in. And you have to make sure that the scientific evidence that they're quoting is sound science. Oh, sorry, I've got some weird stuff going on my slide here. So these are some pictures that are incidents of pipeline leakages, spills, and the problem with oil, as you probably know, is that it floats on top of water. It's easily carried places. So it can get into the ground, it can travel great distances, and it's really difficult to clean up. I actually used to work for an environment consulting firm, and I got sent up to Alaska to do some soil samples, and we were right on the pipeline that's up there because the pipeline was leaking and it was contaminating people's groundwater. So our job was to go up there and take these core samples from the soil and see how much oil was in there and get some data for them so that they could mitigate the issues, take out the contaminated soil, put in new soil, make sure the groundwater was clean and all that, and repair the pipeline. Now, when we talk about oil, the majority of the reserves of crude oil in the world lie in the Middle East. 67% of that crude oil is in the Middle East. Russia happens to contain the most natural gas, and again, the US possesses the most coal. But over half the oil in the world is in that Middle East area. And these oil bearing countries quite some time ago decided that what they were going to do was band together and kind of, form their own little union, is what the idea was. They were going to work together and control and regulate not only the production of oil, but also the pricing and how much they were exporting off to the world. And so their organization they created was called OPEC. It stands for Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And it's basically 12 developing countries that got together and they kind of run the major economics of that oil. So you can see the members down there. We got in Africa, you got Algeria, Angola, Libya, Nigeria, in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And then you've got South America, Venezuela, and Ecuador. So all of these countries are part of OPEC. Well, so what does OPEC mean for you and I? Well, there was a big controversy back in the early 70s. In about 1973, all these Arab nations, okay, if you go back to the slide, the Middle East nations there in brown, the Arab nations of OPEC decided that they were not going to sell any oil to any nations that were supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Well, it turned out that US was an ally of Israel. We were supporting them in this war. And so OPEC said, fine, US, screw you, we're not giving you any oil. And so suddenly we were extremely reliant on foreign oil and we didn't have any coming in. And you saw in 1973 our gas prices nearly tripled practically overnight or almost quadrupled. Um, they shot way up and you literally had lines of cars all down the street lining up and they would stand in line all day to get their ration of gas. And what they ended up having to do was have these rations where they said if you have an even street number, if your house is an even number, you can get gas on Mondays and Wednesdays. If you're an odd number, you can get gas on Tuesdays and Thursdays to try and regulate all this. But the idea was that, this was a major wake up call. People were suddenly realizing how dependent on foreign oil we were and how dependent on oil and non renewable energy we were. Now, what were our reactions to this oil embargo? Well, one of the first things the US did was they implemented a speed limit, a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. And what they were aiming to do there was increase gas mileage for automobiles. So they wanted people to, drive at about a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit because that's where kind of you get the best gas mileage for your car. They also began doing research into renewable energies, using more biomass or wood. They started looking into wind and solar as well. In fact, President Carter at the time went as far as installing solar panels on the White House, and he allocated a lot more funding for that renewable energy research, even more so than any other president to date, by the way. And the government also wanted to develop more on the nuclear power plants and coal because coal was a domestic source. So we wanted to try and reduce our reliance on that foreign oil. Of course, we learned really quickly how dependent we were on foreign oil resources. And then when the Yom Kippur War ended, that embargo was lifted, and we once again started getting oil from the OPEC nations. So by the 1980s, oil prices were dropped back down again. And what do you know? Everyone was just like, oh, everything's fine. Let's just forget about renewable energy research. And it all stopped. In fact, when Reagan came into presidency after Carter, he didn't want people freaking out and worrying about this. So he actually took the solar panels off the White House and basically was like, we've got nothing to worry about. You guys don't need to worry about it. You know, it's not a problem at all anymore. And so he just took all the solar panels down and a lot of the research went away. So what are the current impacts? Well, as you know, the Middle East is very politically volatile, and the majority of oil reserves are over there. So that's a constant concern for us, and that's why you're seeing a lot more being developed in these tar sand reserves, getting a lot more of our oil to be more domestically supplied. But in my slide here, despite political disagreements, we do have a pretty close relationship with Saudi Arabia because one of the reasons is we're really careful with that relationship is because they have 22% of the world's oil reserves. So we want to make sure we have a good relationship with them. They're our number 3 supplier. So let's go over the pros and cons of oil or petroleum. The pros are that in general, it's fairly cheap. That's one of the issues in the United States versus if you go over to Europe. We don't basically have the PPE, polluter pays, the PPP, the polluter pays principle. In other words, you go to the gas pump and you pay $3.50, $4 a gallon of gas, which, seems painful to us these days because gas used to be like 2.50. However, if you go over to Europe, you're paying easily 12, 13, $14 a gallon. The reason is that Europe is factoring in mitigation costs. So they know that they're causing pollution and they take some of the money that goes into paying for that gas and they use it to mitigate some of the issues. Whereas in the United States, we don't do that. Instead, we allow people to file lawsuits and then you have the price of gas doing this and you never know exactly where it's going to be. The other pro to oil is that it has a lot of uses. Transportation, heating homes, it lubricates machines, it's an ingredient in asphalt. We make all kinds of plastics all around our house. We even use it in fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, inks in your pen, paints, medicines, upholstery. I mean, all kinds of stuff. It has a wide range of use, so it's a very useful product. The cons, again, non-renewable, just like coal. We are using it at a rate that nature cannot resupply us with. It takes millions of years to create it. We're using it up in a few hundred years. So non-sustainable, non-renewable. The reserves are also not nearly as vast as the coal reserves. So, like I said earlier, you go into an oil pocket and geologists say, there's 300,000 barrels of oil down here. Realistically, you're only going to get about half of that out. So we don't really have as much oil as we would like to think we do. We have a lot more coal. Um, and then another con, oil spills and seeps. You get, those oil spills like we had down in the Gulf Coast where all that oil spilled out into the water. It creates lots and lots of problems. You can have damage not only to the wildlife, you can also damage drinking water, rangelands, and just major damage to the environment in general. There's a link on the PowerPoint lecture for the Chevron in Ecuador, so you can read about some of the issues there. And then finally, like I was talking about earlier, the damage that is caused by using oil is not paid for by the industry or by you and I, the consumer. Okay, we're not factoring in that mitigation cost. So at some point, that's going to turn around and nip us in the bud, and we're going to end up having a lot more costs and a lot more consequences that we need to deal with. So those are things that you need to keep in mind. Okay, now I promise next time we will actually be talking about natural gas.